went over, and then we had this switch of laptops and whatnot. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jacque Clements. I am the Director of Professional Development at the Association of Indiana Counties. I'm a former county auditor in 2 different counties, Tipton and Clinton. I'm a former state representative, and now I'm working at the association doing what I love, and that's teaching and training local government work. Today, what I'm going to talk about to you briefly is appropriations and encumbrances. Wes went over the big budget picture, and so I'm going to look at the small picture of appropriation and encumbrances. One thing right off the bat you want to think about, which is one of your duties, is that you must have an appropriation before you can spend any of the cash in the county. Now, there are a few exceptions to that rule, and a list of those can be found at a website that I gave to you in this PowerPoint. It's the County Auditor's Manual, and it has a list of some of those funds that don't have to be appropriated. But unless the statute specifically says that it doesn't have to be appropriated, before anyone in the county can spend any money, it should be appropriated or shall be appropriated by this body, the County Council. To start the process, all requests need to be made by either the elected official or the department head. It is then approved by the County Council, and it is monitored by the Board of Commissioners. And when I say monitored by them, they approve all claims that are going to be expended from that appropriation. A couple of exceptions to that rule are listed here. One is insurance. And if you have a reimbursement for insurance that you received, or let's say you have a vehicle that's damaged, you get an insurance payment from your insurance to fix that vehicle. That money can be put right into a line item by the county auditor in order to pay that bill when that vehicle is repaired. It doesn't need to go through you. As long as that money is spent for exactly the repair of that vehicle, then it doesn't need to be appropriated by the body. It can all be taken care of by the fiscal officer. Reimbursements of state and federal grants. If you have a federal grant, normally in the federal grant, it's money that is given up front. It's advanced to you. It tells you specifically what that can be spent on. The county council doesn't have to appropriate that money. Now, I will tell you, in some of the counties, it is the home rule practice that they choose to, and that's okay, but it's not illegal for the auditor to cut a check from those federal grant funds, provided that grant has the stipulation and it is an advance grant. If it's a reimbursable grant, those must be appropriated first before it can be spent. The council won't allow or shouldn't allow expenditures greater than the grant. So they have to appropriate money within that grant total before it's spent. So a federal grant that's advanced doesn't have to be appropriated. A federal grant or a state grant that's reimbursable does have to be appropriated. There are a few state grants, while they require under the statute to be appropriated, if the grant details the expenditures throughout the grant, the Board of Accounts states that they will not take exception in the audit as long as it's detailed in the original grant. Yes. Any department can pursue a grant. It should go through the Board of Commissioners, because in most counties, the Board of Commissioners will assign those final grants because sometimes grants have matching funds to go with them. And so every grant should be done through the Board of Commissioners and then either appropriated or not appropriated appropriately by this body. That answer your question? But anybody can go for a grant. A county sheriff can go for a grant. County commissioners can go for a grant. Community corrections or probation could go for a grant. All of those different grants out there. But usually they're of specific nature, and they usually go before the Board of Commissioners for final approval before the grant's submitted.
Council members could pursue that.
Yes, you could. Yeah.
Excuse me for my ignorance, but within the
That's exactly right. We all follow the same statutes, but we have probably at least 80 different ways of getting that project done.
way to get all the council and commissioners together, a day that specifically deals with whatever topic that we're dealing with, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's grants, whether it's.
And we will be glad to put that on the agenda for the upcoming council meeting. By all means, that'd be a great topic to have some discussion on what those grants are, whose role it is in each part of those grants. Is that what you're asking for?
I mean, it's best practices.
Right.
Every industry has best practices, and I don't think.
You know, I can tell you just by experience, there are some, as I travel the state, there are some counties where up until just a few years ago, the county auditor had no clue what the grant was and was writing checks from the grant funds really with no knowledge of what was happening. And so it's very important that the county auditor is in the mix of this, because they need to know whether it is one that needs to be appropriated by the body or whether it is one that can come out. And if the county chooses to have a home rule, they can do that.
It's just like we're all dealing with the opioid crisis.
Exactly.
Counties are doing it better. And we need a forum that we can get together and share that.
Right. And I will make a note of that. Thank you. Okay, so the other thing that can be done without appropriation is if you write a check to somebody and it is an erroneous payment, maybe it was a duplicate payment and it came back, that check can then be voided and put right back into the fund or into the appropriation from which it was written. Or if they send you a reimbursement check for that erroneous payment, it can go right back into that line item that it was paid from. It's the only place it can go, but it can go back into that line item it was paid from within the current year. Can't switch years on us. If it happens in December and you don't get the refund till January, it goes in the cash flow. Okay, so before money can be dispersed, we need to consider a couple of things. Is there a sufficient appropriation for the expenditure? And here's the big one that a lot of people get confused with. Is there enough money in the fund? So just because you have an appropriation doesn't mean there's enough money in the fund that you can spend that entire appropriation now. In the budgeting process, we work on a budget, an annual budget, and we get revenue throughout the year, and our two big disbursements are in June and December. So we need to ensure that there's enough cash in each of those funds before we can write a check. If there's not, there's procedures that you can take care of to do interlocal loans or different things. Obviously, most of your appropriations are done in the annual budget, but there are some that come out throughout the year. When those additional appropriations come in, you need to be aware that is there enough cash in the overall picture between your levy and your estimated revenues to cover that additional appropriation. And I'll be speaking with the auditors, the new auditors tomorrow, to give them a kind of an Excel spreadsheet that they can work that each time to make sure that there's enough cash to cover an appropriation before you approve it in an open meeting. So if someone's asking you, it would be good for you to know or be able to ask the question, is there enough cash to cover this appropriation? There are a couple of reports that you can ask your county auditors, and I have them listed here by the two, what I'll call major vendors in the state that do the financials throughout the state. Some of the other larger counties have different vendors. They have their own or they have one, but the vast majority of our counties are under either the Harris system or the Lao system, and these are the name of the two reports that you can, as a councilman, at any point in time, go in and request your county auditor to print for you for any department, any fund that you might want to visit. So appropriations when they're not sufficient, there are a couple things that you can do to take care of that. You can transfer money. transfer appropriation from one line item to another, or you can do an additional. So for a transfer, you must transfer within a budget classification with no council approval. If you're moving between classifications, then it requires council approval. No department head can move money from supplies down to capital purchases without the approval of the county council. Transfers can only be made within a department. You can't transfer from the county recorder over to the county sheriff. Has to be within a department, within a fund. And if you do need to reduce one department and increase another because you don't have cash flow to cover just a general additional appropriation, then there is a process where you do a reduction of appropriation and then an additional at the same time to allow that to happen. If it's within the category, the statutes allow the department head to request the fiscal officer to move that appropriation. If it's outside of the category, then the statutes require council approval to move that expenditure. Yes. Yes. That's correct. And I gave you the statute that authorizes that. There are two reasons why, let me go here. The other is an additional appropriation, and there's the statute for that and what needs to be done. In order for an additional to happen, the department head or elected official must request it. The auditor, sure. If you want to do that as a home rule, I would think you could check with your county attorney and be able to do that. But the vast majority of counties don't want that authority. But there is such a thing as home rule, and you could create a resolution or an ordinance in your county that would allow that to happen. Yes. You can do things in addition to the state statute. You check with your county attorney. But I think you have a vast majority of county councils that want to know when those appropriations are moving from one category to the other. So an additional appropriation must be requested by the department head. The auditor's going to check and make sure there's enough cash in the fund for the year to cover it. A notice of your public hearing must be published 10 days prior to your meeting, that additional is going to be discussed in the meeting, and then that additional must be approved in a meeting. Cannot be approved in a work session. Can't just walk into the auditor's office and say, go ahead and do that. Has to be done in a public meeting. Reductions of appropriations happen in the same manner. It's just you're reducing it instead of increasing it. And the couple of reasons that you might do that is the fact that you need to move it from one department or another, or you might have something that you budgeted for in October of this year that by September of next year you're not going to use, and you might want to go ahead and reduce it so the money can't just be spent on something that you don't want it spent on. So encumbrances is the last thing we're going to touch on, and encumbrances are one that gets very confusing, especially for newly elected officials. But encumbrance is that money that was committed in 1 year, and it's not going to be expended out of the cash funds until the next year, the ensuing year. And so in order to do that, that's very feasible to do, but if you so choose to do that, you must have either a contract or an invoice that is dated in the current year There must be sufficient appropriation in place to cover that, and then it has to be done, it has to be acted on in the ensuing year. You can't encumber money in December that you're going to spend in January. You have to wait till January to encumber the money. Only the amount that is due, left due, on that either contract or invoice can be, or the amount of the appropriation that is left can be encumbered. And that encumbrance can only be spent on for that specific invoice or contract. And let me give you an instance. We had a county home who needed a new roof. And so we went out and we had money available in the current year. So we went out and we got an estimate on what it was going to cost to replace that roof at the county home. The work didn't get done, but we had the contract that the proposal that we had accepted and agreed to. So we encumbered the money from that contract. Come February, the county decided they didn't want to use that vendor for that roof repair and still wanted to use that money. Cannot. Goes back into the fund and you have to appropriate the money then. An encumbrance can only be spent for those invoices that they were encumbered for. If they're not used, they go back into the cash fund. Question?
So we just encumbered some money Tuesday night. We weren't supposed to do that.
Until January. Because you're still in the current year. Your new budget hasn't taken place.
Yeah, I even asked, how do we know these invoices won't be paid?
Exactly. So
So do we need to do that again in January?
that'd be a question for your county attorney, but if I were your county auditor, I would say yes. For those of you who didn't hear, they had encumbered some money in the December meeting, and she's wondering if they should redo it. I suggested she go to her county auditor, her county attorney, and verify it, but if I were the county auditor, I would say yes. Because it's money obligated in this year that's not going to be spent till next year, and you can't appropriate money in January now. You have to wait till January to do it. You have to work in the current year, except the budget time. So, follow up. Go ahead, Wes.
I had one question on that. Did I hear you correctly when you said that all of the funds have to be there for that encumbrance? So,
No,
okay.
it's the balance of the contract or the balance of the appropriation, whichever is less. So if I have a $500,000 contract that I've signed and I only have $200,000 this year that I have not expended, I can encumber in January $200,000 into next year. But it must be spent for that invoice. Yes. Well, it does, but Kathy, that's a different topic. Can we say that one for later? Thanks. Okay, so follow the AIC, and I don't mean to cut you off short, but I want to get us back on schedule here. Follow the AIC. This is our webpage. By all means, if you have questions, email me, call me. My telephone, I apologize I didn't put my telephone number on here. I don't know why I didn't. But it's online. I'll be around the whole conference if you have any questions. I know I kind of sped through this pretty quickly, but I was hoping to get us back on schedule. Any questions? Thank you, and it's great to see